Welcome back to Unplanned. I'm Sam, your host, and today we're back with Jesse Kanson-Benanav. And Jesse and I have talked about doing this on a somewhat regular basis, but leave it to Sam. It's taken only a couple of months to get back over to CIC in Boston. How you been?
Been all right. Been well. Welcome to Boston.
Well, thank you. I took the Red Line, and then I wasn't sure what your closest T stop is.
Oh, yeah. State Street is closest to here.
All right. So I got off at Downtown Crossing, and then I got a little bit twisted around. So that's why I'm 20 minutes late. Quelle surprise.
Sorry you had to get through the hellscape that's downtown Boston these days.
Well, so I mean
that sarcastically, of course.
I was commenting a little bit that walking down here, it just was so quiet on the streets.
It does feel like Mondays and Fridays are much quieter down here. But the rest of the week, actually, there's a lot going on. I think the downtown bid has a lot of activities. Yeah. I mean, particularly through the summer, with the tourists and stuff. I know there's criticism coming from like couple councilors in Boston about like the state of things downtown around the Common, but like I've been pretty impressed, and it kind of feels like Boston is bucking the doom spiral that a lot of urban downtowns are facing around the country for whatever reason. But the Mondays and Fridays I think are sort of like the dead times.
Yeah, well we'll get back to doom spirals and things like that. I know, I mean, we're not summertime. It's September, we're just getting out of summer, but we've just been through the summertime, so kind of quiet time and, whatever, life goes on. What you been up to? A month or so ago, I saw some news where you were making some news, but what you been up to? What's been going on?
When am I not making news, Sam?
Hey, it's a problem. I just want to let you know that Unplanned is getting booked before the NBC News reporter gets in touch with him. So, and if I'm not allowed to say that, we'll come.
No, that's fine. I don't know. I don't know. Been a busy year, I guess, at Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. Yeah. A lot of our work.
By the way, he heads up Abundant Housing Massachusetts, which you can find on the website where?
AbundantHousingMA.org.
Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. What you been up to? So what's been going on?
So this year we focused a lot on the Affordable Homes Act. That's the housing bond bill that passed the legislature at the 11th hour in July, actually technically August 1st. Our big focus in that was a policy item that legalizes accessory dwelling units, ADUs, in single-family zoning districts across the state of Massachusetts.
Right.
Pretty strong. We put a lot of energy into it, ensuring that it was going to be a strong bill. I would say it's definitely the strongest statewide ADU law in New England, and some people nationally have told me that they think it's the strongest east of the Rockies, out west, California, Oregon. Other states have pretty strong, in some ways stronger laws, but pretty happy about it. There's still some things to work out. The state has to go through a regulatory process. Towns have to understand what they can and can't do, but really excited for that. So that was a big policy win.
Well, that sounds great. I mean, fascinating. And because I've been kind of out of touch, feeling a little bit out of touch, can you just run through briefly for the people who don't follow this, who aren't housing advocates, who don't, know the lingo?
Not everyone thinks about
ADUs.
Housing and ADUs all the time.
Please define ADU right now. 3, 2, 1, go. Yes. No. Tell us first of all, what is an ADU?
Yeah.
What's the issue behind it? What sort of, and what was the legislature trying to solve?
Yeah. So an ADU is short for accessory dwelling unit. Other terms, backyard cottages, granny flats, in-law suites, things like that. It's an accessory unit, an accessory home that generally single-family homeowners will build either in their backyard as an extension to their house, or sometimes inside the existing footprint of their house. But it's a standalone unit. It's like another apartment that they can then rent out to a tenant. Often people use these ADUs to house family members, whether it's maybe an aging family member who needs a little bit more support, or a family member with disabilities that has, can live somewhat independently but needs some support. Oftentimes young people returning to the community from college. living out of state and couldn't otherwise afford to live in the town they grew up in can use them. But really, it's a great way to add additional housing stock in a lot of communities.
Which could be, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead,
Yeah.
also the point of conflict, right? Because you get that density question about...
Yeah, I mean...
maybe, let me rephrase that. What's taken so long? Why has it taken so long to get to this point of actually getting this legislation through?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, the starting point here is that in Massachusetts, we have an extreme shortage of housing. We don't have enough homes in the state. We're not building new homes at a fast enough pace to house everyone who lives here or wants to live here or will be born in the future, or whatnot. We're falling hundreds of thousands of homes short of where we need to be just to meet the sort of status quo demand for housing. And that's causing prices to skyrocket. They've been skyrocketing for over a decade now, and longer in places like Cambridge, where you and I met. And so we need all the tools we can get here in Massachusetts to just build more homes over the coming decades, and build them to be not necessarily subsidized housing, but more affordable than what the market is producing right now. So that's what we focus on a lot at Abundant Housing Massachusetts. What are the regulatory policy changes we can make at the state and local level to build more homes around the Commonwealth? The MBTA Communities Act.
Well, I want to get to that. So that's 3A. We're going to
3A. We would talk about
we're gonna get,
that's one strategy. The ADUs are another strategy that allows homes to be built in backyards, or again as extensions, or within existing homes, really by homeowners. It's a lower, sort of like a gentler way to build some more homes in communities. There's controversy. I mean.
Well, there's always controversy.
There's always controversy. Your question is what took so long to get here?
What do you think was as we know very well, any legislative body is always trying to balance different interests, right? Different people are coming to them with different sets of concerns, sometimes about the same issue. Well, we really need more housing. Well, I don't want to see somebody's backyard turn into another housing unit.
Yeah.
So presumably they've been sort of trying to dance that dance for a while now. What changed, I guess, maybe? Or what's happened that allowed it to happen now?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost that if you look at the Massachusetts state constitution, the power of regulating land use, what can be built where, how municipalities can approve or not approve certain types of development, actually lives with the legislature. Under our state constitution, the legislature has the power to oversee land use planning. But over the years, particularly really starting with like the 1940s and 50s and the expansion of zoning, the Massachusetts legislature gave more and more power to local communities to control land use planning decisions. They essentially gave the power that the legislature have under the state constitution to towns. So we have this framework now where there's 351 municipalities in Massachusetts, cities and towns. We don't have any regional or county government to speak of. So every community, even like a 7.5 square mile Cambridge or a 4 square mile Somerville or a 2.5 square mile Chelsea, they're all making their own decisions about how to grow, how to build or not grow and build new housing, new commercial development, etc. They're doing it in a vacuum. They're doing it with their own interests in mind, not thinking about how decisions that they make or what they allow or don't allow impacts their neighboring communities or the broader region.
And just to tap into that for a second. So I'm not active in a lot of these spaces anymore, other than having these conversations. But the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, is the regional planning agency for the Boston metro area, and it gets to exactly what you're talking about. Like how do you, because decisions in Community A may or may not impact Community B, either in positive, neutral, or negative ways. But if there's no conversation across boundaries, then it's can be a problem.
Absolutely, and MAPC does really important work to bring communities together, to provide technical assistance and capacity to towns to think about some of these issues in the broader context. There are 12 other regional planning agencies across the state.
And does abundant housing work statewide? Are you guys statewide?
We do work statewide because of sort of the dynamics of the housing crisis that we face here and where the housing shortage is.
Yeah.
A lot of our work tends to be eastern Massachusetts,
right.
But we're statewide. We have members all over the state.
Yeah. But anyway, just to finish out on ADUs, because I do want to get on to 3A, which is a whole other conversation about which I know really not very much. So I'm going to look to you to help me understand it and help our viewers understand it more. But so the legislature was willing to tackle this. I assume the governor was behind this. I don't know that. But.
So the point is we have this housing crisis, right? We're falling hundreds of thousands of homes short of demand. Municipalities generally use zoning to keep new types of housing out of their borders. And so we're just in this sort of spiral of like, we don't have the strategies or the tools we need to build a lot more homes for everyone, to house people, to make housing more affordable, et cetera. And so Governor Healy, back in October of 2023, proposed this broad housing bond bill. In Massachusetts, we do these 5-year housing bond bills that basically authorizes the state to borrow money to pay for a variety of housing programs. The last one was when Charlie Baker was governor in 2018. That was a $1.9 billion borrowing package. Governor Healy proposed what at the time in October was, I think, a slightly over $4 billion housing bond bill, again, authorizing the state to borrow money to pay for affordable housing production, a variety of programs. What she did, which is...
Before you got into that, so periodically the state goes out and issues bonds and gets all this money that they can...
Exactly.
And this is a question I don't know the answer to, but you might, on the Charlie Baker one, so 1.9 million, I think. Did that money all get... Billion. Did that all get spent? So that money all got spent down?
Great question. I don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily have to all be spent.
Right.
So it's not. This is not a budget, right? It's not a spending bill.
Right.
It's a borrowing bill. Right. It authorizes borrowing, but it doesn't require that borrowing to happen.
But then the new governor comes in, Maura Healey, and she says, "Well, we want to get back at this issue, and we want some more money in the pot."
Yeah.
So she then...
she proposed what at the time was about $4 billion. So again, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, what Charlie Baker passed was, the legislature passed and he signed a record $1.9 billion.
Right.
She came in and proposed this over $4 billion, breaking the last record. But what she did, which is unique, that generally really more for tradition's sake, I guess, for lack of a better term, she added on a bunch of policy items to that bill, which is generally not done when we do bonding bills in Massachusetts. The legislature likes to keep the bonding and then policy separate. But she sort of went on a limb and said, in addition to authorizing borrowing to pay for affordable housing programs, accelerating stalled mixed income developments, et cetera, and a bunch of other, revitalizing public housing, et cetera, we're going to propose some policy items that are not connected to borrowing or spending, one of which was this statewide legalization of accessory dwelling units.
Interesting.
There were a few other policy items that she had proposed. A real estate transfer fee was a very controversial one that ultimately was not included in the bill that passed the legislature, much to the chagrin of many advocates and organizations that worked hard to protect that. And I don't know, I think in the end there was about 20 policy items that were included. Our big focus as an organization, committed to how do we reform zoning, permitting, just like the general regulatory process that holds us back from building the homes we need. Like our focus became this accessory dwelling unit piece, protecting what was a very, very strong proposal from Governor Healy, protecting it from being watered down as it went through the legislative process. We committed quite a bit of time and resource to that, and feel very grateful about how it turned out.
Yeah.
And the work that the legislature, including folks like Jim Arciero, who's the House Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, Senator Lydia Edwards, who's the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, some of our legislative partners like Rep. Vargas in Haverhill, Senator Crichton in Lynn, all worked really hard along with leadership to protect this ADU piece of the bill. It didn't at every point look like it was necessarily going to be included or be included in such a strong way, but we're grateful that they listened to us and really hundreds and hundreds of other advocates who came out for our lobby day, who sent letters, communicated with their representatives, and kept it strong.
We're going to pause for 2 seconds and we'll be right back. We're back with Jesse Kanson-Benanav. Jesse, you were just telling us about your ADU work, and that sounds like a real victory, I got to say.
Yeah.
I can imagine from your perspective, you're like, we named it, we said what we wanted to do, and we actually did it. It sounds like it was
I mean, it's a big policy win. The proof will be in the implementation, right? The administration has projected it could result in 8,000 to 10,000 ADUs being built
in the
next 5 years, but we'll see. We'll
see. And there's obviously a lot of the greater population densities are in the Boston metro area.
Yeah.
A lot of, depending on the community, that's where a lot of the pushback can also come from as well.
Yeah.
So that'll be fascinating to see that play out. And I'm guessing you guys will be right.
Yeah, we'll be in the middle of it. We'll be watching.
All right, so I want to switch topics now because there's another topic that is very important to a lot of communities. We mentioned MAPC. It comes up a lot in some of the regional planning discussions. You're going to have to walk us through this because I actually know not very much about it, but I want to learn a lot about it because it is fascinating from a policy perspective and from a regional planning perspective. And that's what I'm going to call 3A, Chapter 3A, which is the MBTA Communities Act. Is that
colloquially known as MBTA Communities Act.
All right. I would like you to, first of all, give us a quick rundown of what the heck it is.
Yeah, sure.
And then let's get into some of the issues it's raising right now, because it's ongoing right now.
Absolutely.
I know communities are grappling with it right now.
So this goes back to actually the COVID legislative session. It was the 2019-2020 legislative session that was extended into early 2021. At the end of that legislative session, the legislature passed a broad economic development bond bill that included what had previously in previous sessions been a standalone bill, again colloquially called the MBTA Communities Act, that ended up being Section 3A of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 40A, which is our state zoning act. And it was a pretty short law in and of itself that was passed by that legislature and signed ultimately by Governor Baker at the time. Essentially what it does is require the 177 statutorily defined MBTA communities, this is any city or town that has MBTA rail or subway, light rail, commuter rail
just
service.
to put a point on that, MBTA is our regional transit agency.
Yes.
And it includes buses, various forms of rail, boats even. I don't know if
actually ferry terminals are included. Basically any community that has MBTA service. Buses don't necessarily count because there are a lot of towns that just have like a bus line that runs through maybe 4 times a day. But if you have rail service or ferry service or things like that, or are adjacent to one, 177 municipalities are now required to adopt multifamily zoning districts of a reasonable size. Reasonable is not defined in the law and comes in a little later in the story, of reasonable size where multifamily housing of at least 15 units per acre must be allowed as of right? So 177 cities and towns in Massachusetts, many of which have no zoning to allow multifamily housing even by a special permit, have to allow apartment buildings of 15 units per acre by right.
And is this
near transit?
I was going to say adjacent. I assume there's some near.
So so the state then previously the Department of Housing and Community Development, which
we used to call smart growth. I don't know if that term is still used.
Less so, I would say, but still.
But the idea is you've made the investment in the transit line maybe 100 years ago.
Yeah.
People are benefiting from that. Your community should have housing that works in conjunction with that transit to supply the housing the region needs. Right.
Exactly. So 177 of these cities and towns now have to adopt multifamily zoning districts. I would point out 15 units per acre, that's the minimum density. That's not very dense. That's your sort of traditional like Greater Boston triple-decker neighborhood. Yeah. We're not talking about building hundreds of units on just a couple acres, right? Although that would certainly be considered in compliance.
Yeah.
And some places have done that, like Cambridge under this law. So that's what happened in 2021. This law was passed.
Yeah.
It was left up to the state's housing agency, which was previously called the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, under Governor Healy has become a full secretariat, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities.
Okay.
Nonetheless, this agency was responsible for putting together guidelines that governed the implementation of this law, what towns needed to do to comply with the law, defined this question of sort of reasonable size that went undefined in the law, and then actually put together an implementation timeline for the different types of MBTA communities.
So not jump ahead, but take us right into it, because my very, very limited understanding is that communities are still grappling very seriously with, well, what does this look like when we actually try to write it up and get it into some format? Is that accurate? I don't know. My sense is not a lot has been built from the 3A legislation yet. But
not a lot has been built from it yet. Part of why is because although the law was passed in January of 2021, we're now here getting towards the end of 2024, it wasn't the implementation under these guidelines that the state had to promulgate. Implementation did not begin until last year, 2023, and it was only the rapid transit communities, anyone with subway or light rail service, so Cambridge, Somerville, Brookline, Newton, Chelsea, a few others, because bus rapid transit in the case of Chelsea is included. Only the 12 rapid transit communities had to comply by the end of last year.
Interesting.
Milton is included.
Was an issue. Right?
Milton is a rapid transit community under the definition that the state used because it shares the Mattapan trolley line with Boston.
Right.
There are stations, there's access to stations directly from Milton. They did pass zoning that's in compliance with this law through town meeting at the end of last year, but then ultimately held a citywide referendum that overturned that compliance.
Right.
It brought them out of compliance with the law and the regulations, and they are now being sued by Attorney General Campbell. And there's a lot of details in there. That case will be heard before the state Supreme Judicial Court in October 7th, I believe. So coming up soon. We're actually working on an amicus brief to the court on this.
Interesting.
But
yes, go ahead.
So that was 2023.
Right.
The rapid transit communities, most of them complied, although the state is still reviewing all of them to make sure they are truly in compliance. But like Newton and Brookline and some others had to pass new zoning. Right. Somerville legalized triple deckers across the entire city. That's their form of compliance. Right. I believe Cambridge ended up submitting sort of Kendall Square existing zoning with some tweaks. Now we're in 2024. In fact, we're now towards the end of 2024.
Actually, but just a more of a technical question on the actual law/regulations. Is it at each transit stop?
No, only one. This is a good clarification.
For example, Cambridge has multiple red line stops.
You only need to apply a by right multifamily zoning district near one transit station. You can certainly expand it. Right, Somerville did do their form of compliance is not legalizing, sort of re-legalizing triple deckers citywide.
Yeah.
And so it sort of applies to every red line, orange line, and green line stations they have in the city of Somerville.
It's already compliant, I assume.
Well, they actually had to reform their zoning to do it.
To make it work. But so, for example, and we'll keep going with the story, but Kendall Square obviously has hundreds and hundreds of units now near a red line stop. So I presume that's already...
so one of the challenges is that there is no requirement that the zoning has to result. First of all, this is a zoning mandate. It's not a production mandate.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that every town has to build new housing.
Right.
They just have to allow it under zoning. Also, it is not a requirement to zone for net new housing. So what we have seen some communities do is apply zoning over existing multifamily buildings, which are unlikely to be torn down and like rebuilt in higher density.
Right.
So this, particularly in 2024, where it's now the commuter rail and large adjacent communities, those are towns next to commuter rail stations.
They have to will include the North Shore and the South Shore. And
yes. It's basically any town with a commuter rail station
right.
or a large population town next to a town that has a commuter rail station has to comply. And that's like, I'm blanking on the number. I think it's 120 or so of the 177 that fit description. So they all have to comply by the end of this year.
Interesting.
A challenge is that most, I guess, of those are, in contrast to last year, where the rapid transit communities are mostly cities, with the exception of like a Brookline and a Milton, where it's town meeting. Most of them are cities, like Cambridge, Somerville, Newton, right? They have city councils that pass zoning.
Right.
This year, the bulk of the 120 or so communities that have to comply by December 31st have town meeting. So unlike a city council that meets every week.
Explain to us why that's different and why that's an important little factor in all of this.
Massachusetts has our unique town form of government where the legislative body of every town is town meeting. There's two forms of town meeting. One is representative town meeting, where you elect a handful of your neighbors to create the legislative body, this town meeting. So for instance, Brookline is a representative town meeting. They have a 255 person legislative body because of all the precincts they have and the numbers that are elected, et cetera. And then open town meeting, where basically every registered voter can show up and creates the legislative body of the town. And because these are sort of not informal, but like volunteer opportunities, unlike your time on the Cambridge City Council.
I always thought, before this is like when the Europeans first arrived on these shores. This is like the proto-democracy. It is the most fundamental version of quote-unquote democracy that you can get.
I mean, this is
with all its challenges
basically,
as well.
This is like more direct democracy than like a ballot initiative. Exactly. And so that this is the form of government in towns. They only generally meet once or twice a year. So all regulations, bylaws, or ordinances and bylaws that the town is going to adopt each year are considered by, whether it's representative or open town meeting, by the town meeting for like a couple days. They like show up at the high school gymnasium for 4 or 5 days a year and pass all the legislation, although a lot of towns will have a spring and a fall town meeting. And there is a process to do a special town meeting as necessary. But it's not like a city council that meets every week. You have a limited period of time when an ordinance or bylaw is introduced that it has to have a public hearing and then be voted on. All these 120 or so towns have to adopt a zoning district by the end of the year and really only have a couple opportunities to do it.
And when you say year, you mean this year, 2024?
By December 31st, 2024, all of the commuter rail and large adjacent towns have to adopt the zoning under this law. And so I'm only really just talking about the logistical challenge. There's also the, I don't know, lack of a better term, social challenge of like, this has become a controversial law. There are a lot of people who see it as a state overreach despite the fact that we talked about earlier, land use regulation does actually live under the state constitution with the legislature. They see it, some residents of the Commonwealth see it as state overreach.
To give local residents a little bit of a bone here, regardless of what gets produced in terms of actual housing, for many of these communities, this will be a brand new form of zoning that they have maybe never encountered before. So in that sense, emotionally, change is always hard.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's this huge, one can imagine a huge fear factor of, oh my goodness, here we go.
Yeah.
They're going to start building high-rise buildings.
Blah,
blah, blah, blah,
yeah.
blah, blah, blah.
And a lot of what we're trying to do at Abundant Housing with our partners like MAPC and CHAPA, Mass Housing Partnership and others, is dispel some of those myths. Like we're not building towers, high-rise towers in like Lincoln or whatever, right? That's not what this is, right? But there is that fear. There's also this like concern about like the changing character of communities. A lot of towns in Massachusetts, even that have commuter rail stations that are only a handful of miles from Boston, think of themselves or really do maintain this like rural character. Think about a place like Wayland or Sudbury or something, right?
I mean, Lincoln is a great example.
Exactly.
It's very close. You couldn't travel further back in time into a wealthy New England community than going to Lincoln, Massachusetts. It really is.
It's like you're in a small like Vermont town
Exactly.
in some ways, but you're only a few miles from Boston. And so
not to pick on Lincoln, I think Lincoln is a beautiful community.
Absolutely.
But it's exactly, at least mentally, I think what you're...
Exactly. And so I think there's a lot of challenges there in terms of like the implementation. There are, while I will say the vast majority of towns, both the rapid transit communities last year and this year it's commuter rail and adjacent towns, while the majority of them have passed zoning districts that they deem as in compliance and the state is currently reviewing, or are on path to do that. There are a few cases like Milton last year, Winthrop right now, Holden out near Worcester, and a few others that have put a sort of flag in the ground, whatever the cliche is, and said, like, we are not going to do this.
Interesting.
And in some cases, the town planners are bringing zoning districts to town meeting and they're failing, or the select board just like refuses to allow these issues to be voted on. This just happened in Marblehead, actually.
Oh, interesting.
So there are a few cases.
Presumably those will end up in a court somewhere. And
a lot of it depends on the current case that the AG has filed against the town of Milton, which again will be heard by the SJC on October 7th.
Right.
Not to get too deep in that, but there are questions that the town has raised on a variety of things, but that includes the authority of the Attorney General to enforce this law. The law as it was written didn't say that the Attorney General has the authority to do it. It wrote in some consequences, loss of funding if you don't do it, and Milton is maintaining, we'll just forego that money, but the AG can't force us to do this.
Interesting.
Now, I am not an attorney,
right?
But I speak to attorneys on this. Like I said, we're also writing with some attorneys an amicus brief from our organization and some partners. Our belief is that the Attorney General does have standing as the sort of chief enforcement officer in the state, the chief lawyer. There is case law precedent for her enforcing aspects of Mass General Law, even if it's not written in that she or he may.
But that may be actually. I wonder if that version of that case has ever been brought before, or that's really a precedent-setting ruling as to the power of the Attorney General.
I think my understanding is there is some precedent already.
Right.
But I think. Again, I don't know.
Massachusetts has been around for a couple hundred years, so presumably there has been a case.
Yeah. But I think to the question about these other towns that are not in compliance or are not even voting, I think a lot of them are sort of in a wait and see position. If the Attorney General is victorious in her suit before the SJC and she has authority, like she just 2 days ago put out a message that she has said in the past, compliance with 3A is mandatory and my office will enforce it.
Right.
if
So
the
she's
Supreme Court,
she's not equivocating on
she is
on her.
not equivocating
Right.
until I believe, and supposedly, like, if the SJC says that she can't enforce it, I think all bets are off about this law, and we'll have to think about other strategies.
Interesting.
I'm pretty confident that the Attorney General, again, I am not a lawyer, but I'm pretty confident that the Attorney General has the authority to enforce state law, and if that is the case, and that is the ruling, which I expect the ruling to be from the SJC, whether it's Holden or Winthrop or Marblehead, a few other towns, they're going to have to come into compliance, or they will also be sued by the Attorney General.
It's an interesting question, just even in this fact this version of events where almost regardless what the SJC decides, some towns have already passed the zoning.
Yeah.
So some towns Cambridge presumably is already of that mentality. So they're happy to be in that group.
Yeah.
But even towns that are maybe further out on the commuter rail system are like, no, this makes sense, we would support this.
Yeah.
And then there are these holdouts, and then the SJC will make some decision about the authority of the Attorney General. Yeah. But instead of being a universal 100%, maybe it ends up more of a patchwork, which you could imagine if we can use the word, from a political, it could be challenging down the road. How do you see all this playing out in the near term? Because end of 2024 is coming up pretty soon. We're mid-September now. Where are you guys as an organization? What's your thought process? Do you think they'll be at some point on December 31st where you can say, yeah, we pretty much met that goal. We've got a couple of issues out here. But
I do think that by the end of 2024, again, I think the number that have that deadline is around 120 or so communities. I will say the vast majority of them will have adopted a zoning district. It won't necessarily have been formally deemed by the state as in compliance, because the state has to review every bylaw to ensure it complies with the law and the guidelines. But I believe the vast majority of them will have adopted something that they believe is in compliance. And I will say, they're not just leaving it to, a lot of these towns have one person in the community development or planning department. They're not just leaving it up to that person to shepherd it in. There's a lot of resources from the state, from MAPC, from others, actually giving technical assistance to communities to write these zoning bylaws in compliance with the law, and even run community engagement processes behind it. We also have a team of organizers, not in every community, but in a bunch of communities, who are working with advocates to help them educate their neighbors about why this law is important and why their town should comply with it. So it's not like the towns are being left to their own devices. Nonetheless, I would say, because of all that, I do believe that most towns will be in compliance by the end of this year, and it will be a small handful. Mostly the ones I've named. There's a couple others that I haven't named, but I think probably we'll see more than close to 120 of them will have adopted something by the end of this year. Next year, there's about 20 with the small adjacent communities. These are small population towns that are next to towns with a community rail station. They have a December 2025 deadline. But the capacity that all of them together have to zone for is less than what Cambridge has to zone for under this law. Every sitting town is given a zone capacity target. So the rubber meets the road this year. The combination of this year and last year with the rapid transit, this is where the bulk of the new zoned housing under this law will come from. Next year will just sort of be the icing on the cake.
Jesse Kanson-Benanav, thank you for being back on Unplanned. You and I have talked about doing these at some periodical, regular rate.
And I'm happy to talk about things that are not just housing.
And so you'll see both of us coming up on episodes in the fairly near future. I had a bit of a backlog from just summer sort of quiet time. So, but we'll get you back on. Thank you for walking us through these two issues today, because there was really a lot of great information. Helped me understand the issue a lot better. I'm sure you helped all our viewers understand.
I probably raised more questions than answers, but
Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Any questions, comments? Feed them to him.
You got it.
But we'll see you again real soon.
Sounds
and thanks again.
Good to see you, Sam. Thanks for having me.